afternoon, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be hosting this conference on democracy and the gender binary. And it is a real pleasure to be sharing our reflections on the topic with all of you, even if it is through a screen and with all the troubles that are associated with it. As we are all very, very aware, these are very strange and difficult times, and I do appreciate all the more you being there. Well, I should begin by saying that this conference is part of a larger project, a project on sex, citizenship, and non-binary identities. The project is funded by the Spanish government and has gathered an international and interdisciplinary group of scholars covering the fields of law, mostly constitutional law, but also international and human rights law and jurisprudence, as well as social scientists, political science, and social anthropology. All its members participate in this conference. Welcome to all of you. The project has just got off the ground. This is in fact our first academic meeting as a research group. We would have liked to have this meeting in person. Indeed, we did not give up on this possibility until the very last moment, but things are the way they are. And indeed, for all we, and at least I, often complain about technology and the way it conditions our lives and make it difficult, more difficult than it seems to me would be life without technology sometimes. I am grateful that it has provided us with the means for such developed telematic communication as this, as the one we're having today. I am grateful that it has allowed us to meet at all. And although the former has all the drawbacks of not meeting in person, it also has the advantage of transcending borders. It has allowed us to have attendees to this conference from different parts of the world. Well, the aim of the project is to put our expertise together to tackle the question of the gender binary and how its strictures are affecting democratic citizenship. It is ultimately to identify ways and strategies to amend this state of affairs. This joint exercise as a research group starts here and now with this seminar, with this conference. Reflecting upon the gender binary takes us necessarily to reflect upon feminism. Feminism is about the deconstruction of the sex gender systems, in as far as these systems are based on male domination, on men's position of structural power. This structural power, men's domination, rests on men's control over the spheres where power is exerted. And this control starts with the very definition of those spheres. It starts with the monopoly of the capacity to call the shots, to pick the games, to set the rules of the games, to fit men's own profile. This leaves women either out of those games or at a structural disadvantage when we join the games. In the modern West, gender power dynamics are constructed upon the gender binary, the male-female hierarchical dichotomy and the series of dichotomies associated with it, public-private, active-passive, strong-weak, rational-irrational or emotional, independent-dependent, or management of other people's dependence, actually we should say. Here in the West, feminism has focused on deconstructing gender power dynamics by enhancing the female side of these dichotomies, by trying to deprive the dichotomies of the element of hierarchy that fits them. The problem is that in doing so, feminism runs the risk of confirming this very sex-gender system. Feminism runs the risk of remaining stuck in what is known as the Wollstonecraft dilemma. According to the dilemma defined by Mary Wollstonecraft in times of the Enlightenment, the two routes that women have at their disposal in their struggles for full citizenship reveal themselves as problematic. These are the roots of equality, and it is the root of equality and the root of difference. Equality involves extending to women the rights men have defined and designed for themselves, the rights that define male citizenship. Difference, on the other hand, involves claiming women's specific capacities, interests, needs, as these are differentiated from men's needs, men's interests, men's capacities. The problem is that one way or the other, men continue to be the point of reference. Whether it is through equality or through difference, feminism risks pursuing citizenship on the basis of male standards, either by aiming to access these standards or by aiming to confront them, to differentiate women from them. But in both cases, those standards are likely to be confirmed. As Carol Pateman put it, these roots remain within the confines of the patriarchal state and make women's access to full citizenship impossible to achieve. In order to break the confines of the patriarchal state, in order to question men's experiences as points of reference, we need to start by questioning not only women's role within the gender binary system, women's differences and inferior position with respect to men's. We need to question the gender binary system itself. Doing so leads us to embrace the idea that it is not only women and women's experiences that the gender binary excludes from full citizenship. It is also all those people and experiences that fail to meet the male standard model. So women are indeed the first and foremost objects of male domination and mostly suffer from it. The more women try to break free from binary assumptions, but other people suffer from it too. These are all those who rebel against the binary system, who do not fit the male standard model of citizenship that it imposes on us. They are the gender dissenters, those whose sexuality, gender identities, and their expressions stray away from that model. Not surprisingly, some feminists like Monique Wittig regard lesbianism the point of departure as the point of departure for the construction of a new transgender subject. Thinking along these lines leads us to the realization that if we take seriously the aim of deconstructing gender power structures in favor of parity democracy, of democracy based on citizens' parity capacity to interact as autonomous individuals, if we aim to construct a society of individuals capable of self-rule, and this is after all what democracy is all about, if we want to achieve all that, then the gender binary must go. Questioning the gender binary thus seems like the final achievement of feminism, the end goal of the struggle for the deconstruction of male domination based on a male-defined notion of citizenship. In this context, it is surprising that the deconstruction of the gender binary is stirring up so much turmoil within feminism. It is surprising in particular that some cis women feel threatened by claims for the recognition of gender identities that challenge the binary system. I think we all need to reflect on this and try to understand where the problem lies. This is happening in Spain and it's happening in other countries too. The trend towards the deconstruction of the gender binary, however, seems unstoppable. It is unstoppable because reality is unstoppable. And reality tells us that the gender binary is a cultural construction, that it does not only undermine women's role as citizens, but leaves out of the field of the citizenry all those who do not fit within the straitjacket of its dichotomies. This trend is unstoppable, first of all, in the trans movement. The trans movement is becoming very strong in this regard. And so it's vindication for trans identities and expressions. In this field, for example, we only need to look at the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, which has ruled that these identities, trans identities and expressions, conform the right to sex gender reassignment as included within the right to personal autonomy recognized in Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. It is true in 1986, the court left some margin for states to appreciate the cost of recognizing these identities in the case of Ruiz versus UK. But since then, the court has come to recognize these rights based on the acknowledged international tendency favorable to the social and legal recognition of trans identities and their expressions. We have the case of Goodwin versus UK in 2002. To be sure, the court still states, the European Court of Human Rights still states that the medicalization of sex gender reassignment, that demanding or not a diagnosis of gender dysphoria as a condition for accessing sex gender assignment surgery, falls within the margin of appreciation of states. that there is not enough consensus on this matter within the Council of Europe. We have the decision of AP Gasson and Nico versus France, 2017. Nevertheless, the trend is also there. The trend to go beyond this medicalization of the trans claims is also there. In 2015, the resolution 2048 of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recommended the abolition of mental health diagnosis and medical treatments as preconditions for the recognition of gender identities. Also in 2019, the World Health Organization agreed to strike gender identity disorders out of the list of mental illnesses. In some European countries, this is already a reality, and such diagnosis is not requested in countries like Malta, Norway, Denmark, Ireland, Belgium, or Portugal. Moreover, the European Court of Human Rights, although it hasn't officially rejected the line of case law where it doesn't interfere with the countries imposing these requirements, has ruled in some cases that these requirements can be too stringent. This is the case of SB versus Italy, ruled in 2018, and has ruled this even beyond nationality, also including as holders of this right some immigrant population, as is in the case of Rana versus Hungary from this year, 2020. In Spain, we have an act on gender identity, that dates back to 2007. And although it allows for self-determination of sex gender identity to some extent, it is still firmly based on this gender binary. It still relies on the gender binary as it relies on the pathologization and medicalization of gender identity. It also sets an age limit that the Constitutional Court declared unconstitutional last year in 2019, saying that people underage must have access, or that their capacity to decide their gender identity must be acknowledged if they show enough maturity. They are in a situation of stable transsexuality. In addition to that, or in this context, some bills are at the moment being under discussion in Spain concerning trans identity and equality claims, not without controversy though. These bills are geared towards tackling the question of age, as well as other questions such as privacy and equality of opportunities, and they also aim to go beyond the medicalization of gender identity. Most importantly, they seem to have taken the binary challenge on board. This takes us to intersexuality. This is the greatest challenge to the gender binary. It is what Judith Butler called the bodies that do not matter, the bodies that we could say do not exist. And yet, according to data offered by the World Health Organization, the data I've seen up from 2015, between 0.05% and 1.7% of the world population is intersexual. The percentage varies according to what kinds of intersexuality we are talking about, of how perfect intersexuality is. There is indeed a wide spectrum of intersexuality. Intersexuality can be related to chromosomes, to hormones, to gonads, and or to genitalia. And it can stem from atypical chromosomic development, from irregularities in the production of hormones, mostly androgens, from atypical development of gonads, from atypical external genitalia. These factors give rise to a variety of combinations that make the reality of intersexuality a complex one, and one that is prone to different classifications, most of which are conditioned by cultural contexts, and the cultural contexts that feed medical conventions. Speaking about cultural contexts and medical conventions, it is revealing that intersexuality became an issue in the West, indeed an obsession in the West, during the 19th century. That is during the time when the gender binary was cast in the building stones of our modern states. Pre-modern conceptions of sexual identity and their expressions saw them rather as a continuum between the extremes of male on the one side and female on the other. Indeed, both male and female were seen as variations of one single sex, which was obviously the male sex. And the differences between them were seen more as matters of culture, what we would call gender, than as matters of biology. There was more continuum in biology and more dichotomization in cultural terms, interestingly enough. When the gender binary became the touchstone of modern societies in the 19th century, there came with it an obsession to label cases of intersexuality, or hermaphroditism, as it was then called, as merely apparent. There was no real hermaphroditism, there was only apparent hermaphroditism. There couldn't be real hermaphroditism. Even doctors frequently dealing with cases of hermaphroditism sustained that it was a mere appearance. In order to turn this obsession into a medical truth, genitals were constructed as the decisive element of sexual identity. This gave rise to a subsequent obsession with genitalia and their external appearance, a very modern Western phenomenon indeed. Genitalia thus became the markers of sex, but also of adequate gender and sexual behavior. In the end, in the 19th century, sex, gender, and sexuality became the composing elements of an inseparable triad. They were linked together inseparably. They couldn't be pulled away from one another. Sex, gender, and sexuality all had to point in the same direction. They were expressions of each other. This obsession with genitalia thus brought with it a concern with gender aptitudes, attitudes, and sexual behavior. And any departure from what was considered to be appropriate aptitudes, attitudes, or behavior was regarded as a sign of hermaphroditism. Having homosexual leanings of behavior was regarded as a sign of hermaphroditism. And if these sexual attitudes, aptitudes, or behavior were not in accordance with the physical sex, with the genitalia, they were considered to be a clinical case. The obsession with genitals and their appearance has continued well into the 20th century and is only now starting to fade. It starts with an obsession with the adequacy of the penis. In order to fulfill a male binary role, a male role that conforms with the sex-gender binary that is typically Western modern, an adequate penis is required. This explains that most babies identified as intersexed because of ambiguous genitalia are assigned to the female sex. There's a wealth of stories that tell such cases. I mean, most of them don't have a happy ending, of children that are assigned to the female sex and then rebel against it. Genitalia display a strong cosmetic role as markers of the ideal gender model, or gender models, both male and female. The problem is that seeking the ideal genitals leads to disrespect for real genitals. In the end, as Susan Kessler points out, intersexuality does not threaten children's health. It threatens children's culture. It is culture, not health, that demands surgery. This is ironic. The irony is that if we oppose nature and culture, nature is represented by genitals and it is supposed to be immutable. Culture is supposed to be mutable. Genitals, nature, biology is supposed to be immutable. Biology is seen as the ultimate truth, and this ultimate truth is related to sex, to genitals. As Michel Foucault said, at the bottom of sex, there is truth. Our sex is regarded to harbor what is most true about ourselves. This is Foucault speaking. And I said, it is an irony because in the end, biology, as again Susan Kessler argues, is no closer to truth in an absolute sense than a deity is, that God is. It is culture that rules over biology. If culture, and I'm quoting Kessler, demands gender, physicians will produce gender. And of course, when physicians produce it, the fact that gender is demanded will be hidden from view. The truth, if there is one, is that scientists find fewer biological, psychological, and social dichotomies, and more biological, psychological, and social continua. That there's no such dichotomy, dichotomies between male and female, that they are a cultural construction. Because indeed, what is immutable is not biology, but cultural truths. The dogmas that culture produces to create what Kessler calls incorrigible propositions. These are claims to truth that become a matter of faith in their own unquestionable basic assumptions. If we assume the existence of incorrigible propositions, then we realize that what is different among different ways of seeing the world is not the objectivity of the world, are the possibilities stemming from basic assumptions, cultural assumptions about the way the world works. Then again, according to Kessler, although it seems as if biological facts have an existence independent of gender labels, the process is actually the reverse. It is gender labels that condition biological attitudes to gender assignments. This leads us to the construction of citizenship through cultural assumptions on the bodies, what Michel Foucault calls body politics. These reflections allow us to grasp the extent to which trans demands are transgressive, because deciding gender on demand leads to the denaturalization of gender itself, to the deconstruction of biology or nature as the basis of truth. But intersexuality poses an even greater challenge. If we agree that, that sex and gender are intertwined in the sex-gender system that Gay Rubin theorized, then the fact that biology is not binary must lead to the recognition of gender identities beyond the gender binary. Indeed, modern insistence on redirecting intersexuality to binary patterns by discarding it as simply apparent and or channeling it through surgery is a clear indication of this. In this sense, the medical approach to the intersexed, including surgery, marks the modern construction of gender, underlines the modern construction of gender, strengthens it, it's a consequence, it's a requirement of it. But note that paradoxically, it also is at the origin of trans claims for sex-gender reassignment and the binary transgressions they entail. It is the surgery deployed over intersexed bodies in the 19th century that settled the ground for trans claims for sex-gender reassignment. In any case, as far as the intersexed go, if we accept that they do not need to be operated on, that surgery pursues cultural rather than medical purposes, then we are set on the road towards a new cultural truth, where gender itself disappears or is at least very much diluted as a social marker. And this seems to be the trend. A handful of, a bunch of countries that have already gone beyond the gender binary in legal terms, either through legislation or through case law. This is the case of Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Malta, Iceland. We are working on it, as I mentioned before, perhaps in Spain, but also beyond Europe. We have some states in the United States, in Canada, in Ontario and British Columbia, in Argentina, Uruguay. Australia, of course, was a pioneer in this field. New Zealand, Kenya, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and I'm sure I'm leaving some behind. So far, however, countries like this country, Spain, countries like mine, are still based on the sex-gender binary. The regulation of the civil registry demands that babies are registered as male or female, and in case of doubt, they are referred to medical advice. It is interesting because in the legislation on public security says whether DNA, Spanish DNA, must include personal data, and it mustn't include anything having to do with race, ethnicity, religion, etc., or a sexual orientation or sexual identity. And still, it is our sex is required as information, and this information must be provided in binary terms. All the above points to the need to go beyond the gender binary and to embrace postmodern sex-gender systems, a postmodern sex-gender system, or to speak at least, to conceptualize sex and gender in postmodern terms. To this end, we need to listen to what Alice Dreger calls wounded storytellers. We need to listen to them, to the stories told by people who are wounded by the binary system. We need to listen to them, and we need to listen with them to their wounded stories. And we need to do so in the knowledge that their stories, like all stories, are never islands in themselves. They're part of a given culture. We need more postmodern narratives, sex-gender narratives, the narratives of intersex and trans people who cannot be redirected or don't want to be redirected to the gender binary. With these narratives come postmodern vindications of autonomy, of relational autonomy, of our capacity for self-rule within the context of our complex relations and identities. Thus defined, autonomy must be vindicated against modern paternalism and the power structures that lie behind it, based on biological truths constructed by those who manage the economies of truth and power. If sex-gender boundaries were less rigid, there would be fewer overlapping of male and female traits, including boys and girls. And maybe the very notions of trans identities and expressions and of the intersexed might become redundant. In the end, intersexuality cracks at the core of the construction of modern gender. In the end, gender is, as the oft-quoted Suzanne Kessler says, a product, a reflection of the way intersexuality is managed. Thank you very much.